September 2018, federal prosecutors filed criminal fraud charges against Elizabeth Holmes, founder and former CEO of Theranos, a blood testing company once valued at $9 billion. The charges detailed a decade-long scheme to defraud investors, doctors, and patients through systematic deception about revolutionary technology that never actually worked. Holmes had raised over $700 million from sophisticated investors including Rupert Murdoch, the Walton family, and Betsy DeVos. She had recruited a board of directors featuring 2 former secretaries of state, 2 former senators, and multiple former military generals. Her company had partnered with Walgreens and Safeway, planning to revolutionize healthcare by offering hundreds of blood tests from a single finger prick. None of it was real. The technology didn't work. The tests were unreliable. The results were dangerous. And Holmes knew it. She wasn't a failed entrepreneur who tried and couldn't deliver. She was a fraud who built a billion-dollar company on deliberate lies, fabricated demonstrations, and systematic deception that continued for over a decade. This wasn't innovation that fell short. This was criminal conspiracy that endangered patient lives while making Holmes the youngest self-made female billionaire in America. She was a fraud who built a billion-dollar company on deliberate lies, fabricated demonstrations, and systematic deception that continued for over a decade. This wasn't innovation that fell short. This was criminal conspiracy that endangered patient lives while making Holmes the youngest self-made female billionaire in America. Silicon Dreams. Elizabeth Holmes arrived at Stanford University in 2002, joining a chemical engineering program that attracted students interested in biotechnology and medical applications. She demonstrated academic competence without being exceptional, solid grades, active participation, but nothing suggesting the genius-level innovation she would later claim. Classmates remembered her as ambitious and determined, someone who spoke frequently about wanting to change the world and build a company, though her specific technical interests remained somewhat vague. During summer 2003, Holmes worked in a laboratory at the Genome Institute of Singapore, conducting research on SARS virus detection. The experience exposed her to medical diagnostics and the challenges of developing reliable testing systems. She became interested in drug delivery mechanisms and began developing ideas about medical devices that could simplify blood testing. The concepts were preliminary and technically ambitious, reflecting the optimism of someone who didn't yet fully understand the scientific obstacles involved. When she returned to Stanford for her sophomore year, Holmes began working with chemical engineering professor Channing Robertson on patent applications related to medical devices. Robertson was an accomplished academic with expertise in chemical reaction engineering and medical applications. His involvement lent credibility to Holmes's early ideas and provided mentorship that helped her develop initial business plans. The patents they filed focused on devices for drug delivery and blood testing, though the technical details were rudimentary compared to what Theranos would later claim to have developed. Holmes' decision to leave Stanford came in spring 2004, after her second year. She had filed provisional patents and developed a basic business plan for a medical device company. More importantly, she had identified potential investors through family connections and Robertson's professional network. The decision to drop out was calculated rather than impulsive. Holmes recognized that Stanford's entrepreneurial culture celebrated founders who left school to build companies. Jobs, Gates, and Zuckerberg had become billionaires without finishing college. She positioned herself in this tradition, suggesting that formal education would only delay her world-changing mission. The initial business concept focused on developing a patch that would analyze blood and deliver medications automatically. The technical challenges were enormous, integrating blood analysis, wireless communication, and drug delivery into a wearable device exceeded current technological capabilities. But Holmes wasn't pitching to engineers or scientists. She was pitching to investors whose understanding of biotechnology was limited and who were susceptible to Silicon Valley narratives about disruption and innovation. Her first major investor was Tim Draper, a prominent venture capitalist whose firm had backed companies like Hotmail and Skype. Draper had family connections to Holmes. His daughter was her childhood friend. This personal relationship gave Holmes access to pitch him directly, bypassing the typical gatekeeping that kept most young entrepreneurs from reaching established investors. Draper invested $1 million in late 2004, providing the initial capital to formally establish Theranos and begin operations. The investment reflected several dynamics that would characterize Theranos fundraising throughout its history. First, personal connections mattered more than rigorous technical evaluation. Draper invested based on relationship and Holmes's persuasive pitch rather than independent verification of the technology's feasibility. Second, the investment amount was relatively small for venture capital, limiting the due diligence investors typically conducted for larger deals. Third, Draper's participation lent credibility that helped Holmes raise subsequent funding from investors who assumed Draper had thoroughly vetted the opportunity. Holmes used the initial funding to rent laboratory space and hire several employees, including scientists with relevant expertise in diagnostics and medical devices. The early team attempted to develop the wearable patch concept, but quickly encountered insurmountable technical problems. The device required miniaturizing complex analytical chemistry, maintaining sterile conditions in a wearable format, and achieving reliability that would be acceptable for medical decision-making. After months of effort, it became clear that the original concept wasn't feasible with current technology. Rather than acknowledging these limitations, Holmes pivoted to a different concept while maintaining the ambitious vision. If a wearable patch was too complex, perhaps a desktop device could achieve similar goals. Theranos would develop a small analyzer that could run comprehensive blood tests on tiny sample volumes. The device would still revolutionize blood testing by enabling testing in pharmacies, doctors' offices, and eventually homes. The vision remained compelling even though the technical approach had changed fundamentally. This pivot established a pattern that would continue throughout Theranos' history. When technology didn't work as promised, Holmes would modify the claims while maintaining the revolutionary vision that attracted investors and partners. The specific technical details were always evolving, always just on the verge of breakthrough, always protected by trade secrets that prevented outside verification. Investors who had committed based on the initial concept continued supporting the company as it pursued modified approaches, reluctant to acknowledge that their initial investment thesis had been invalidated. By 2006, Theranos had raised approximately $6 million from investors including Draper and his firm Lucas Venture Group, and several individual investors attracted through personal connections. The company employed about 25 people working in a modest facility in Palo Alto. They were developing prototypes of desktop analyzers intended to run blood tests on small samples, though the devices remained unreliable and incapable of producing results comparable to traditional laboratory testing. Holmes' management approach during this period revealed characteristics that would later enable the fraud. She operated in extreme secrecy, dividing employees into isolated teams that couldn't communicate about their work. She claimed this protected trade secrets, but it also prevented employees from recognizing that different teams were encountering similar problems, suggesting fundamental technical obstacles. She responded to technical setbacks by demanding harder work and greater commitment rather than reconsidering whether the goals were achievable, and she began cultivating the public persona that would make her famous: the black turtlenecks, the deep voice, the intense eye contact, the absolute certainty about changing the world. The voice deserves particular attention because it became such a distinctive element of Holmes' presentation. Her natural speaking voice was higher pitched and more variable in tone. The deep, unwavering voice she used in business contexts was reportedly a conscious affectation, developed to project authority and confidence in male-dominated business environments. Former colleagues and employees noted that her voice would sometimes slip to higher registers when she was off guard, then return to the deep monotone when she became aware of being observed. This conscious performance extended beyond voice to encompass her entire public presentation. The Steve Jobs-style wardrobe wasn't just convenient, it was deliberate branding designed to invoke comparisons to Silicon Valley's most celebrated visionary. The intense, unblinking stare was cultivated to project confidence and conviction. The carefully crafted origin story about wanting to help people avoid needle sticks after watching a family member struggle with blood draws while emotionally resonant was simplified narrative that obscured more complex and self-interested motivations. Holmes was constructing a persona designed to attract investment, media attention, and cultural celebration. The persona worked remarkably well. By 2007, Theranos had raised over $90 million despite having no working product, no revenue, and no clear path to solving the fundamental technical problems that prevented their devices from working reliably. Investors continued funding the company based on Holmes' vision, her persuasiveness, and the prestigious advisors she was assembling. The advisory board and board of directors Holmes constructed were critical to maintaining investor confidence despite lack of technical progress. She recruited George Shultz, former Secretary of State under Reagan and Treasury Secretary under Nixon. She brought on William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. She added Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. She recruited Sam Nunn, former Senator and Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. She brought on James Mattis, retired Marine Corps General who would later become Secretary of Defense. This board composition was extraordinary for a medical device startup. These were not healthcare experts, medical researchers, or diagnostics industry veterans. They were political and military leaders whose expertise had nothing to do with clinical laboratory science or medical device development. Their presence served a specific purpose, lending prestige and credibility that distracted from the absence of scientific validation or peer review. The strategy exploited a quirk of human psychology. People assume that prestigious individuals conduct thorough evaluation before associating with organizations. If Kissinger and Schultz served on Theranos' board, surely the company must be legitimate and its technology must work. Otherwise, why would such distinguished figures risk their reputations? This reasoning was logical but wrong. The board members joined based on Holmes' persuasive presentations and their trust in colleagues who recommended her. They lacked expertise to evaluate the technology and apparently never demanded independent validation before lending their names to the enterprise. George Shultz's involvement deserves particular scrutiny because his participation would later have tragic consequences for his own family. Schultz was in his 80s when he joined Theranos' board, a revered figure in Republican foreign policy circles with decades of distinguished government service. Holmes cultivated a close relationship with him, frequently visiting his home and speaking with him for hours about Theranos' mission. Schultz became a true believer, convinced that Holmes was a genius who would transform healthcare. His grandson, Tyler Schultz, would later become one of the most important whistleblowers, exposing Theranos' fraud. But in the early years, George Shultz's involvement was instrumental in attracting other prestigious board members and investors. His reputation made skepticism seem unreasonable. If George Shultz believed in Holmes, who were others to doubt her? By 2010, Theranos had raised approximately $92 million and was valued at roughly $1 billion, despite still having no working product and no revenue. The company had burned through tens of millions, attempting to develop functional devices without success. The fundamental technical problems remained unsolved. Blood samples from finger pricks were too small and too contaminated to produce reliable results across the range of tests Theranos promised. Miniaturization created new problems with calibration, quality control, and result accuracy. No amount of engineering effort had overcome these obstacles. Holmes faced a critical decision point. She could acknowledge that the original vision wasn't achievable with current technology, scale back to more modest goals that were technically feasible, and build a sustainable business around those limited capabilities. Or she could maintain the revolutionary vision by fabricating evidence that the technology worked, deceiving investors and partners about capabilities that didn't exist, and hoping that somehow the technical problems would eventually be solved before the fraud was discovered. She chose fraud. The decision wasn't a single dramatic moment, but rather a series of choices that progressively crossed ethical and legal boundaries. When demonstrations for potential investors or partners were scheduled, Theranos employees were instructed to use commercial blood analyzers hidden inside Theranos-branded casings. When validation data was requested, reports were modified to present better results than actual testing had achieved. When problems arose with patient samples, results from commercial analyzers were reported as if they came from Theranos devices. Each step seemed potentially justifiable in isolation. Demonstrations using modified commercial equipment could be rationalized as showing what the Theranos devices would do once fully developed. Optimistic interpretation of validation data could be framed as confidence rather than deception. Running patient samples on commercial analyzers could be positioned as temporary backup while Theranos devices were being perfected. But collectively, these practices constituted systematic fraud designed to create false impression that Theranos' technology worked when it didn't. Building illusions. The transition from struggling startup to fraudulent operation accelerated around 2010 as Theranos pursued partnerships with major pharmacy chains. Holmes recognized that investor funding alone wouldn't sustain the company indefinitely. She needed revenue, customers, and public validation that would attract additional investment and justify the billion-dollar valuation. Partnerships with Walgreens and Safeway would provide all three, but only if Theranos could demonstrate that its technology actually worked. The Walgreens partnership negotiations revealed Holmes's deception tactics at their most sophisticated. Walgreens executives were considering a deal to install Theranos testing centers in thousands of stores nationwide, creating a new revenue stream while differentiating their pharmacies from competitors. The partnership's value to Walgreens depended entirely on whether Theranos could deliver reliable blood testing that met regulatory standards and provided clinical utility. Walgreens conducted due diligence, requesting technical information, validation data, and demonstrations. Holmes and her chief operating officer, Sunny Balwani, who was also her romantic partner, managed these requests carefully. They provided selective information that presented Theranos' capabilities optimistically. They conducted demonstrations using modified equipment that produced impressive results because the tests were actually being run on commercial analyzers rather than Theranos devices. They claimed that comprehensive technical disclosure was impossible due to trade secret protection. The trade secret argument was central to preventing independent verification. Holmes insisted that Theranos' innovations were so valuable and so easily copied that allowing outside experts to examine the devices or review detailed technical specifications would enable competitors to steal the technology. This reasoning seemed plausible in Silicon Valley culture, where stealth mode and secrecy were celebrated, but it prevented exactly the kind of independent technical evaluation that would have revealed the fraud. Walgreens' due diligence process was inadequate. They relied heavily on Theranos-provided information rather than demanding truly independent validation. They were impressed by the prestigious board members, assuming that figures like George Shultz and Henry Kissinger wouldn't associate with a fraudulent company. They were swayed by Holmes's presentation and the compelling narrative about democratizing healthcare, and they faced competitive pressure. If Walgreens didn't partner with Theranos, perhaps CVS or another competitor would, giving them a significant market advantage. The partnership was announced in September 2013. Walgreens would install Theranos testing centers in its stores, beginning with a pilot program in Phoenix, Arizona. Patients could walk in, get blood tests done with a finger prick instead of venipuncture, and receive results within hours. The pricing would be transparent and affordable, often much cheaper than traditional laboratory testing. The announcement generated enormous positive publicity for both companies. Behind the scenes, Theranos faced catastrophic technical problems. Their proprietary device, called Edison, couldn't reliably run most of the tests they were offering to patients. The engineering team had worked for years attempting to solve problems with sample volume, contamination, calibration, and quality control. They had made incremental progress on some issues while discovering new problems that seemed insurmountable. The solution Theranos implemented was fraudulent, but effective at maintaining appearances. They would run most patient tests on commercial analyzers manufactured by Siemens, rather than using Edison devices. When patients provided finger prick samples, those samples were often supplemented with additional blood drawn by traditional venipuncture, negating the supposed advantage of Theranos' approach. Results from commercial analyzers were reported to patients and physicians as if they came from Theranos technology. This deception allowed Theranos to operate blood testing centers in Walgreens stores while providing reasonably reliable results that wouldn't raise immediate red flags. Patients received blood test results that were usually accurate because they came from validated commercial analyzers. Walgreens executives saw satisfied customers and didn't look too carefully at what was happening behind the scenes in Theranos' laboratories. And Holmes could claim that her technology was successfully operating at scale, even though the underlying premise was fraudulent. The Safeway partnership followed a similar pattern but with even higher stakes. Safeway CEO Steve Bird became convinced that Theranos would revolutionize healthcare and retail pharmacy. He invested enormous resources into preparing Safeway stores for Theranos testing centers, spending over $350 million on renovations and infrastructure. The investment was based on Theranos' promises about their technology's capabilities and their timeline for regulatory approval and rollout. Theranos provided Safeway with demonstrations and validation data that were misleading or fabricated. They showed device prototypes that appeared to work because they were actually commercial analyzers in Theranos casings. They presented timelines for regulatory approval that were unrealistic given the actual state of their technology. They claimed to have solved technical problems that in reality remained unsolved. Bird and other Safeway executives were sophisticated business leaders, but they lacked expertise to evaluate medical diagnostics technology. They relied on Theranos representations and were apparently reluctant to push too hard for independent verification because they feared losing a partnership they believed would provide significant competitive advantage. This dynamic partners, desperate to believe that Theranos' technology worked because the potential benefits were so large, recurred throughout the company's history. The regulatory situation added complexity to Theranos' fraud. Medical devices that diagnose disease or guide treatment decisions require approval from the Food and Drug Administration before they can be marketed. Clinical laboratories that perform patient testing must be certified under Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments regulations. Theranos needed to satisfy both frameworks to legally operate blood testing centers and use proprietary devices. Holmes pursued a strategy of avoiding comprehensive FDA review while obtaining minimal regulatory clearances that created appearance of legitimacy. Rather than submitting Edison devices for full FDA approval processes that would require extensive validation data and independent review, Theranos sought approval only for a single test, a herpes simplex virus antibody test, using a simplified review pathway for low-risk devices. They never submitted their device for comprehensive review, covering the hundreds of tests they were offering to patients. For laboratory certification, Theranos obtained CLIA certification for their Newark, California laboratory facility. CLIA certification required meeting various quality standards and passing inspections, but the inspection processes were limited in scope and couldn't fully evaluate whether novel devices were producing accurate results. Theranos could operate a CLIA-certified laboratory while using devices that hadn't been properly validated, as long as they maintained appearances of following proper procedures. This regulatory arbitrage allowed Theranos to claim they were operating legally and meeting all regulatory requirements while avoiding the comprehensive reviews that would have exposed their fraud. They could point to their CLIA certification and FDA clearance for one test as evidence of legitimacy, even though these minimal credentials didn't validate the broader claims they were making about their technology. The internal culture at Theranos during this period became increasingly toxic and paranoid. Holmes and Balwani created an atmosphere of fear and secrecy that prevented employees from raising concerns about technical problems or ethical issues. The company was divided into isolated teams that couldn't communicate about their work. Employees who questioned whether the technology actually worked or who raised concerns about patient safety were fired or threatened with litigation. Sunny Balwani deserves particular attention because his role in the fraud was substantial though less publicly visible than Holmes. Balwani was significantly older than Holmes, nearly 20 years her senior, and had business experience from his time at Lotus Software and other technology companies during the dot-com era. He joined Theranos in 2009 as President and Chief Operating Officer, while also being Holmes's romantic partner, though they kept the relationship secret from investors and board members. Balwani was responsible for much of Theranos' day-to-day operations, including the laboratory facilities where patient testing occurred. Employees described him as aggressive, demanding, and dismissive of concerns about technical problems. He would berate staff members who reported that devices weren't working properly, insisting that they simply needed to work harder or be more innovative. He created surveillance systems to monitor employee computer use and communications, fostering an atmosphere where people feared expressing doubts. The combination of Holmes's public-facing leadership and Balwani's internal operations management was effective at maintaining the fraud. Holmes attracted investors, partners, and media attention through her compelling vision and carefully constructed persona. Balwani ensured that internal operations produced whatever results were needed to maintain external appearances, regardless of whether those results reflected actual Theranos technology. Employees who understood that something was fundamentally wrong faced difficult choices. Speaking up internally often led to termination and threats of litigation for allegedly violating non-disclosure agreements or trade secret protection. Going to regulators or media required courage and resources to withstand legal intimidation that Theranos deployed against critics, and leaving quietly meant abandoning patients who might be receiving unreliable test results that could affect their medical care. Some employees chose to stay and document problems, hoping to eventually expose the fraud. Others left and tried to alert authorities, with limited initial success. A few became formal whistleblowers, who would ultimately play crucial roles in exposing Theranos. But for several years, Holmes and Balwani successfully maintained the deception, operating blood testing centers in Walgreens stores while claiming to use technology that didn't actually work. The patient impact during this period is difficult to fully quantify, but was undoubtedly significant. Theranos was running blood tests that affected medical decision-making, diagnosing conditions, monitoring chronic diseases, guiding treatment choices. When test results were inaccurate, patients and physicians made decisions based on false information. Some patients may have received unnecessary treatment based on false positive results. Others may have missed diagnoses or delayed treatment based on false negative results. The specific failures were varied. Theranos's devices had particular problems with quality control, producing results that varied significantly between runs of the same sample. They struggled with calibration, generating results that were systematically biased relative to established reference methods. They had issues with interference from medications or medical conditions that affected result accuracy, and they sometimes simply failed to produce results at all, forcing either rerunning samples or reporting results based on commercial analyzers. Theranos knew about these problems. Internal quality control data showed unacceptable levels of result variation and systematic biases. Employees raised concerns about specific patient cases where Theranos results differed dramatically from results obtained when the same patient samples were tested using commercial methods. But Holmes and Balwani pushed forward with offering tests to patients, apparently prioritizing revenue and growth over patient safety. Famous believers. By 2013, Elizabeth Holmes had become a media phenomenon. Forbes featured her on their cover as the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world, with an estimated net worth of $4.5 billion based on her ownership stake in Theranos. Fortune named her one of the world's most powerful women. Inc. magazine celebrated her as one of their entrepreneurs of the year. The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and other major publications ran glowing profiles describing her revolutionary technology and mission to democratize healthcare. The media coverage followed predictable patterns that Holmes and her communications team had learned to exploit. Reporters wanted compelling narratives about innovation and disruption. They were particularly interested in stories about young women succeeding in male-dominated fields, as this fit cultural conversations about gender equity and breaking glass ceilings. Holmes provided exactly what they wanted: a photogenic young founder with a dramatic origin story, revolutionary technology, and prestigious backers who validated her credibility. Most reporters lacked expertise to evaluate the scientific claims Theranos was making. They relied on Holmes's explanations and the endorsements from her board members. When they requested independent verification or interviews with technical staff, Theranos cited trade secret protection and competitive concerns. The reporters accepted these explanations, apparently believing that conventional journalistic skepticism didn't fully apply to technology innovation stories. The one major publication that maintained skepticism was the Wall Street Journal, specifically reporter John Carreyrou. His investigation would ultimately expose the fraud, but that wouldn't begin until late 2015. Through 2013 and 2014, the dominant narrative in media coverage was celebratory and uncritical. Holmes was portrayed as a visionary genius who had solved problems that had stumped the medical establishment through her innovative thinking and determination. This positive media attention served multiple purposes for Theranos. It attracted additional investors who wanted to participate in the next great Silicon Valley success story. It provided credibility when pursuing partnerships with healthcare systems and pharmacy chains. It made regulators and potential critics reluctant to challenge a company that was receiving such widespread acclaim. And it fed Holmes's ego and reinforced her conviction that she was destined to change the world. The investor base expanded dramatically during this period. In 2013 and 2014, Theranos raised approximately $400 million in new funding at valuations that reached $9 billion. The investors included some of the world's wealthiest and most sophisticated individuals and families. Rupert Murdoch, the media mogul, invested $125 million. The Walton family, heirs to the Walmart fortune, invested $150 million. Betsy DeVos and her family invested $100 million. Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim's family made substantial investment. The total raised from investors ultimately exceeded $700 million. These weren't naive small-time investors, easily fooled by slick presentations. They were sophisticated actors with access to top-tier legal and financial advisors. How did Holmes convince them to invest hundreds of millions in a company whose core technology didn't work? The answer reveals several cognitive and structural failures in how even sophisticated investors evaluate opportunities. First, investors relied heavily on social proof rather than independent technical evaluation. When they saw that other prestigious investors had committed and that George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, and James Mattis served on the board, they assumed adequate due diligence had already been performed. Nobody wanted to be the skeptic who missed the next Apple or Google because they overthought the technical details. Fear of missing out on a revolutionary opportunity overwhelmed skepticism about extraordinary claims. Second, Theranos exploited information asymmetry aggressively. They provided investors with selected data, demonstrations, and testimonials, while blocking access to comprehensive technical information or independent verification. They claimed this secrecy was necessary to protect trade secrets, and investors accepted this explanation without considering that it prevented them from making truly informed investment decisions. Third, Holmes was extraordinarily effective at pitching investors. She had refined her presentation over years, learning exactly what resonated with different audiences. She could discuss the technology in sufficient detail to sound credible to non-experts, while avoiding specifics that would expose problems. She emphasized the social mission and lives that would be saved, appealing to investors' desire to do good while making money. And she projected absolute confidence, never showing doubt or acknowledging problems. Fourth, the investment terms were structured to limit investor governance rights. Theranos issued preferred stock with significant economic rights, but limited voting control. Holmes retained majority voting control through her common stock holdings, ensuring that investors couldn't force independent audits or technical reviews even if they became suspicious. By the time investors realized they had been deceived, They lacked legal authority to investigate or force changes. Rupert Murdoch's investment deserves particular examination because of its size, and because Murdoch had a reputation as a shrewd investor who didn't part with money easily. According to later reporting, Murdoch invested $125 million based primarily on his assessment of Holmes personally, rather than detailed technical evaluation. He was impressed by her intelligence and conviction. He trusted that someone of her apparent caliber, supported by advisors like George Shultz, must have developed legitimate technology. When Theranos' fraud was later exposed, Murdoch reportedly wrote off the entire investment without attempting to recover any funds, apparently accepting that he had been deceived and moving on. The DeVos family investment reflected another dynamic. Betsy DeVos would later become Secretary of Education in the Trump administration, but in 2014 she was primarily known as a major Republican donor and conservative activist. Her family's $100 million investment in Theranos wasn't driven by deep understanding of medical diagnostics technology. It reflected the family's general enthusiasm for entrepreneurship and innovation, combined with the social proof of other investors' participation and the prestigious board members. Carlos Slim's family investment came after Theranos had partnered with Walgreens and was operating testing centers in Arizona. The partnership provided additional credibility. Surely Walgreens wouldn't have partnered with Theranos without thorough evaluation of the technology, but as discussed earlier, Walgreens' own due diligence had been inadequate. The chain of assumed verification continued, with each new investor or partner assuming that someone else had properly validated Theranos' claims. Beyond individual investors, Theranos attracted attention from major media companies interested in partnerships that could help them enter healthcare markets. The Waltons' investment came partly through their interest in potential partnerships between Theranos and Walmart, the family's primary business. These partnership discussions lent further credibility to Theranos while creating additional stakeholders who had interests in the company's success and were therefore reluctant to acknowledge problems. The impact of this celebrity investor base extended beyond the capital they provided. Their participation was used in Theranos' marketing and fundraising materials to attract additional investors and partners. Presentations to potential hospital partners or retail chains would emphasize that Rupert Murdoch and the Walton family had invested hundreds of millions, suggesting that sophisticated actors had thoroughly validated the opportunity. Few people stopped to consider that even sophisticated investors could be deceived by sufficiently skillful fraud. Holmes leveraged the investor prestige to gain access to political leaders and policymakers. She met with Vice President Joe Biden, who toured a Theranos facility in Arizona and praised the company's innovations in prepared remarks. She participated in panels with President Bill Clinton. She spoke at major industry conferences alongside healthcare and technology leaders. These high-level connections created additional social proof, while making criticism of Theranos seem unreasonable or motivated by jealousy of her success. The Obama administration's interest in Theranos reflected broader policy goals around healthcare innovation and cost reduction. The Affordable Care Act had expanded insurance coverage, but hadn't solved underlying cost problems in American healthcare. Technologies that could make diagnostic testing cheaper and more accessible, aligned with administration priorities. Theranos seemed to offer exactly this, and administration officials apparently didn't look too carefully at whether the technology actually worked as claimed. This political attention created complications for regulators who might have been more aggressive in investigating Theranos. When the company had the implicit endorsement of a sitting vice president and was being held up as an example of American innovation, FDA officials and other regulators faced pressure to be supportive rather than skeptical. Some former FDA officials later acknowledged that Theranos' political connections may have affected how regulators approached oversight of the company. The network effects of prestige and credibility that Holmes constructed were remarkably robust. Each prestigious investor, board member, political connection, or media celebration reinforced the others. Skeptics who questioned whether Theranos' technology actually worked faced an overwhelming weight of apparent validation. Why would George Shultz risk his reputation? Why would Rupert Murdoch invest $125 million? Why would Walgreens partner with them? Why would the vice president tour their facility? The circular reasoning was powerful. Theranos must be legitimate because so many prestigious actors endorsed it, and those actors endorsed it because it appeared legitimate. Breaking through this circular validation required evidence that Theranos' technology didn't work and that Holmes had deliberately deceived everyone. But obtaining that evidence was difficult when Theranos operated in extreme secrecy and aggressively threatened anyone who tried to expose problems. Employees who left the company signed restrictive agreements preventing them from discussing their work. Investors who became suspicious lacked access to investigate thoroughly. Media outlets that might have investigated were being pitched positive stories by Theranos' communications team. The system seemed designed to be immune to challenge. As long as Holmes could maintain the appearance of success and prevent independent verification, the network of prestigious endorsements would sustain belief in Theranos despite the absence of actual validated technology. The strategy worked for years, allowing Holmes to build a $9 billion company and become celebrated as one of America's great entrepreneurs while running what was fundamentally a criminal fraud. Laboratory secrets. While Elizabeth Holmes cultivated celebrity investors and media attention, the actual work of running blood tests on patient samples occurred in Theranos laboratories that operated under conditions ranging from chaotic to dangerous. The Newark, California facility where most patient testing occurred became the focus of intense scrutiny once the fraud was exposed, revealing systematic problems that endangered patient health and violated basic laboratory standards. The fundamental issue was that Theranos' proprietary devices, called Edison, couldn't reliably perform most of the tests the company offered. Years of engineering effort had failed to solve core problems with sample volume, contamination, calibration, and quality control. The devices could sometimes produce results for some tests, but the reliability and accuracy were far below standards required for clinical use. Any competent laboratory director would have recognized that these devices weren't ready for patient testing. Theranos' solution was running most tests on commercial analyzers made by companies like Siemens while reporting results to patients and physicians as if they came from Theranos technology. This deception allowed them to provide reasonably accurate results because the commercial analyzers were validated and reliable while maintaining the fiction that their proprietary technology worked, but it created numerous operational and ethical problems. First, using finger prick samples on commercial analyzers that were designed for larger blood volumes required either diluting samples or supplementing them with additional blood drawn by traditional venipuncture. Both approaches undermined Theranos' core value proposition. If patients needed traditional blood draws anyway, what advantage did Theranos offer? The company downplayed or concealed this reality from patients and partners. Second, the small sample volumes from finger pricks were problematic even when diluted. Blood from finger pricks, capillary blood, has different composition than blood from veins. It contains more interstitial fluid and cells from surrounding tissue. These differences can affect test results, particularly for certain analytes. Using capillary blood on analyzers, validated for venous blood, introduced additional sources of error. Third, the improvised testing procedures and frequent equipment problems created quality control nightmares. Laboratory personnel were constantly troubleshooting device failures, rerunning failed tests, and trying to reconcile discrepant results. The pace of testing, with Walgreens locations sending hundreds of patient samples daily, meant that careful quality control was often sacrificed to maintain throughput. Employees who worked in the Newark laboratory described an environment that violated basic laboratory practices. Quality control samples weren't always run according to proper schedules. Proficiency testing, where laboratories analyze blinded samples to verify their accuracy, was sometimes manipulated to hide problems. Device maintenance wasn't performed according to manufacturer recommendations. And most critically, results that failed quality control checks were sometimes reported to patients anyway, rather than being flagged as unreliable. The laboratory directors who were supposed to oversee these operations faced an impossible situation. Under clear regulations, laboratory directors bear legal responsibility for ensuring test quality and accuracy. They're required to establish and maintain quality standards, investigate problems, and refuse to report results that don't meet reliability criteria. But at Theranos, the laboratory directors reported to Holmes and Balwani, who pressured them to maintain testing volume and minimize problems that would slow operations or attract regulatory attention. Several laboratory directors left Theranos after short tenures, apparently unwilling to continue operating under conditions they considered unsafe. Others stayed but documented concerns in memos and emails that would later be used as evidence of the company's violations. The turnover in laboratory leadership was itself a warning sign that should have attracted regulatory attention, but clear inspectors apparently didn't recognize it as such during their routine inspections. The specific types of testing failures were varied and disturbing. Theranos had particular problems with tests that required precise measurement of low concentrations of analytes, exactly the tests where accuracy matters most for medical decision-making. A test for thyroid hormone that's off by 20% might lead to a patient being started on medication they don't need, or missing a diagnosis of hypothyroidism that requires treatment. A test for blood glucose that's inaccurate could cause a diabetic patient to adjust insulin dosing incorrectly, potentially leading to dangerous blood sugar levels. Internal quality control data that later became public showed unacceptable levels of variation in Theranos results. When the same sample was tested multiple times, the results varied far more than the acceptable ranges established by professional laboratory standards. This kind of imprecision makes test results unreliable for clinical decision-making. A physician receiving a result of 150 for a particular test needs to know whether the true value is 145, 155, or whether it might actually be 130, 170. Theranos devices often produced the latter kind of unreliable results. The company also had problems with systematic bias, results that were consistently higher or lower than the true values. This occurred because Theranos devices weren't properly calibrated against established reference methods. Calibration requires testing samples with known values and adjusting the device until it produces accurate results. Theranos either didn't perform adequate calibration or couldn't maintain calibration because their devices drifted out of specification quickly. The interference problems were particularly concerning. Certain medications, medical conditions, or sample characteristics can interfere with blood tests, producing false results. Well-validated analyzers have been tested for common interferences and include warnings about when results might be unreliable. Theranos' devices hadn't been comprehensively tested for interferences, meaning that unknown factors could be affecting results without anyone recognizing it. When problems occurred with patient samples, Theranos laboratory staff faced pressure to produce results anyway, rather than rejecting samples as inadequate or flagging results as questionable. The company had promised fast turnaround times to Walgreens and patients. Delays or rejected samples would undermine this value proposition, so staff were encouraged to work around problems, rerun tests multiple times until they got acceptable results, or simply report results even when quality control suggested they might be unreliable. The documentation of these problems created evidence that would later be used in regulatory enforcement and criminal prosecutions. Laboratory staff kept records of device failures, result discrepancies, and quality control failures. Some employees documented concerning incidents in emails to supervisors, creating contemporaneous records of the problems. When inspectors from Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services eventually investigated Theranos' Newark laboratory in 2015 and 2016, they found extensive documentation of violations. The patient harm from these laboratory failures is difficult to quantify precisely, but was certainly substantial. Thousands of patients received test results from Theranos during the period when the company was using unreliable devices and inadequate quality control. Many of those results were probably reasonably accurate because they actually came from commercial analyzers rather than Theranos devices. But some unknown number were inaccurate due to the various problems described above. Specific cases that became public illustrated the potential consequences. One patient received a test result indicating possible miscarriage when she was actually carrying a healthy pregnancy. Another received results suggesting serious thyroid disease requiring treatment when their thyroid function was actually normal. A third received blood glucose results that led to incorrect insulin dosing adjustments. These cases represented patients whose problems were eventually identified and corrected, but they suggested that many more patients may have been affected without the problems being recognized. The most disturbing aspect was that Holmes and Balwani knew about these problems, but chose to continue operating the laboratory and offering tests to patients. Internal emails and documents showed that they received reports about quality control failures, result discrepancies, and device problems. They were told by laboratory staff and technical employees that the devices weren't ready for patient use. They received warnings that continuing to operate under these conditions risked patient harm and regulatory enforcement. Their response was to suppress dissent, fire employees who raised concerns too persistently, and continue operations while hoping that somehow the technical problems would be solved before regulators or media discovered the issues. This wasn't entrepreneurial optimism or reasonable risk-taking. It was reckless endangerment of patient safety in pursuit of maintaining the illusion that Theranos' technology worked so they could continue fundraising and building their business. Whistleblower warnings. The first serious attempts to expose Theranos' fraud came from employees who witnessed the dysfunction firsthand and concluded that patient safety required them to speak out, despite the personal and legal risks. These whistleblowers faced aggressive intimidation from Theranos' lawyers, skepticism from regulators who were initially reluctant to believe their claims, and social isolation as Holmes' publicity machine portrayed them as disgruntled employees with axes to grind. Tyler Schultz became one of the most important whistleblowers despite being only in his 20s and having limited professional experience. His involvement was particularly dramatic because his grandfather, George Schultz, sat on Theranos' board and was one of Holmes' closest advisors and most passionate defenders. Tyler joined Theranos in 2013 after graduating from Stanford, excited to work for a company that seemed to be changing healthcare and that had his grandfather's enthusiastic endorsement. Within months of starting at Theranos, Tyler began noticing problems. He worked in the laboratory and saw the quality control failures, device malfunctions, and improvised workarounds that characterized daily operations. He observed that most tests were being run on commercial analyzers rather than Theranos devices. He noticed that when Edison devices were used, results were often unreliable and discrepant from results obtained using validated methods. Tyler raised concerns internally through proper channels, documenting problems and suggesting process improvements in emails to supervisors. The response was hostile. Rather than investigating his concerns, Sunny Balwani berated him for being negative and insufficiently committed to Theranos' mission. When Tyler persisted, he was marginalized and eventually pushed out of the company in 2014. After leaving Theranos, Tyler faced an agonizing decision. He possessed first-hand knowledge of practices that endangered patients. He had documentation of quality control failures and unreliable test results. He believed that regulators needed to investigate Theranos before more patients were harmed. But speaking to regulators would violate non-disclosure agreements he had signed and would likely provoke aggressive legal retaliation from Theranos. More personally painful, it would put him in direct conflict with his grandfather, who remained convinced that Holmes was a genius and that Theranos critics were jealous competitors or ignorant skeptics. George Schultz was 94 years old, a revered figure in Tyler's family, and someone Tyler deeply respected. Exposing Theranos would mean challenging his grandfather's judgment and credibility. Tyler chose to do what he believed was right regardless of personal cost. He contacted New York State's Public Health Laboratory, which regulated clinical testing in New York, providing detailed information about Theranos practices. He reached out to federal regulators at CMS, which oversaw CLIA certification, and eventually he provided information to Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou, who was beginning to investigate Theranos. Theranos' response was vicious. Their attorneys sent threatening letters accusing Tyler of violating his employment agreements and demanding that he immediately cease all communication with regulators or media. They hired private investigators to follow him and gather information that might be used to discredit him. Most painfully, they convinced George Schultz to pressure his grandson to recant his accusations and apologize to Holmes. The family dynamics became tragic. George Schultz believed Tyler was being manipulated by people with agendas against Theranos. He couldn't accept that his judgment about Holmes had been so completely wrong. He pressured Tyler to meet with Theranos' lawyers and settle the dispute. When Tyler refused, it created a rift in the family that wouldn't heal until years later, after Theranos' fraud had been publicly exposed and George Schultz finally acknowledged he had been deceived. Tyler wasn't the only whistleblower, though his story received the most attention due to his family connection. Erica Chung, another young employee who worked in the laboratory, also left Theranos due to concerns about quality control and patient safety. She provided information to regulators and eventually testified in legal proceedings about what she had witnessed. Adam Clapper, who worked as a laboratory associate, documented quality control failures and device problems in detailed records he kept during his employment. His documentation would later be used by regulators and prosecutors as evidence of Theranos' violations. Several other former employees provided anonymous information to regulators or media, risking legal retaliation but believing that patient safety required them to speak out. The experiences of these whistleblowers revealed systematic problems with how regulators responded to reports about clinical laboratories. When Tyler Schultz and others contacted CMS with detailed allegations about Theranos violating CLIA regulations, the response was initially slow and inadequate. Regulators were apparently reluctant to believe that a company with such prominent investors and board members could be committing systematic fraud. Part of the problem was structural. CLA inspections were routine and scheduled, giving laboratories time to prepare and present their operations in the best light. Surprise inspections based on complaints were rare, and inspectors focused primarily on documentation and procedures rather than independently validating that test results were accurate. A laboratory could maintain compliant-looking paperwork while producing unreliable results, and standard inspections might not detect the problems. Another factor was resource constraints. CMS and state regulators had limited staff to oversee thousands of clinical laboratories nationwide. They couldn't conduct intensive investigations of every complaint, particularly when the allegations were complex and technical, and they faced political pressure to avoid overly aggressive enforcement that might be seen as hostile to innovation and business. Theranos exploited these weaknesses. When they received notice of inspections, they prepared carefully, sometimes temporarily improving procedures or even suspending use of problematic devices to present a compliant appearance. When inspectors asked questions, Theranos personnel provided carefully crafted responses that acknowledged minor issues while concealing major problems, and Holmes leveraged her political connections, having allies reach out to regulators to vouch for Theranos' integrity and importance. The regulatory response improved significantly after the Wall Street Journal published its first investigative article about Theranos in October 2015. The article, reported by John Carreyrou, detailed allegations from whistleblowers and presented evidence that Theranos was using commercial analyzers for most tests while claiming to use proprietary technology. It raised questions about result accuracy and suggested that the company had misled investors and partners. Theranos' initial response to the article was aggressive denial. Holmes appeared on television and in print interviews, insisting that the allegations were false, that Theranos' technology worked exactly as claimed, and that the article was motivated by competitors trying to damage their business. She produced letters from supportive board members and investors defending the company. She threatened legal action against the journal and Carreyrou, but the article had created enough public attention that regulators could no longer ignore the whistleblower complaints. CMS announced a surprise inspection of Theranos' Newark laboratory in late 2015. The inspection, which lasted several months and involved detailed review of quality control records and actual testing of sample proficiency, revealed catastrophic violations of clear regulations. The inspection report, released in January 2016, documented dozens of deficiencies. Theranos had failed to maintain adequate quality control. Their devices produced unacceptably variable results. Proficiency testing had been manipulated. Personnel weren't adequately trained. Documentation was inadequate or falsified. Most seriously, CMS found that Theranos practices posed immediate jeopardy to patient health, the most severe category of violation, indicating that deficiencies were likely to cause serious injury, harm, impairment, or death. The regulatory findings validated everything the whistleblowers had reported. Tyler Schultz, Erica Chung, and others had risked their careers and personal relationships to report problems that regulators now confirmed were real and serious. The vindication was bittersweet. They had been right, but only after thousands of patients had potentially been harmed by unreliable test results. CMS imposed severe sanctions. Theranos was banned from operating blood testing laboratories for 2 years. Holmes was personally prohibited from owning or operating a clinical laboratory for 2 years. The Newark facility was forced to void 2 years of test results, approximately 1 million tests, and send corrected reports to patients and physicians. The company faced massive fines and potential criminal referrals. The regulatory enforcement was devastating to Theranos' business model. They could no longer operate blood testing centers. The voided test results created liability risks from patients who might have been harmed. The prohibition on Holmes operating laboratories meant she couldn't personally oversee any pivot to legitimate testing services, and the public nature of the enforcement destroyed the carefully constructed image of a revolutionary healthcare company. Walgreens immediately terminated its partnership with Theranos, closing all testing centers in their stores. Safeway, which had invested $350 million in preparing for a Theranos partnership that never fully materialized, demanded return of their investment. Investors began pursuing legal action to recover their funds, and media coverage shifted from celebration to aggressive investigation of how such massive fraud had been perpetrated for so long. The whistleblowers' courage had finally succeeded in exposing the fraud, but the process had taken years and had required enormous personal sacrifice. Tyler Schultz spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees defending against Theranos' intimidation. His relationship with his grandfather remained strained. Erica Chung and others faced career complications as they were associated with a massive fraud case, even though they had tried to stop it. Their experiences raised troubling questions about how American regulatory and legal systems protect whistleblowers. In theory, laws exist to prevent retaliation against employees who report violations to regulators. In practice, companies like Theranos could deploy aggressive lawyers and investigators to make whistleblowers' lives miserable while technically avoiding illegal retaliation. The personal costs of whistleblowing were so high that many employees with knowledge of problems chose to stay silent rather than face the consequences of speaking out. Media collapse. The Wall Street Journal's investigation into Theranos represented one of the most consequential pieces of investigative journalism in recent business history. Reporter John Carreyrou's work transformed Elizabeth Holmes from celebrated entrepreneur to accused criminal, destroyed a $9 billion company, and provided a case study in how media scrutiny can expose fraud that regulators and investors failed to detect. The first red flag was the extreme secrecy around Theranos technology. The company had never published peer-reviewed research validating their devices. They hadn't presented data at major scientific conferences. They refused to allow independent experts to examine their technology or review validation studies. This level of secrecy was unusual, even for companies protecting trade secrets. Legitimate medical device manufacturers typically published at least some validation data to establish credibility with the scientific community. The second red flag was the disconnect between what Theranos claimed and what experts said was possible. Carrie Rue interviewed clinical laboratory scientists and medical diagnostics experts, asking whether Theranos' claimed capabilities were technically feasible. Most experts were skeptical, pointing to fundamental problems with using capillary blood from finger pricks, working with extremely small sample volumes, and achieving reliable results across hundreds of different tests. The consensus was that while some limited testing might be possible, the comprehensive capabilities Theranos claimed weren't achievable with current technology. The third red flag was the pattern of former employees who left after short tenures, particularly laboratory directors and senior scientists. High turnover in key technical positions suggested internal problems. When Carrie Rue began contacting these former employees, some were willing to provide information off the record initially about quality control failures, unreliable devices, and pressure to produce results regardless of accuracy concerns. Building a publishable story required overcoming significant obstacles. Theranos aggressively deployed legal threats against anyone who might provide information to media. The company sent letters to former employees reminding them of non-disclosure agreements and threatening litigation if they spoke to reporters. They hired private investigators to identify Carrie Rue's sources and gather information that might discredit them. And they leveraged their connections with powerful figures to pressure the Wall Street Journal's management to kill the story. Holmes personally called Rupert Murdoch, who owned the Wall Street Journal's parent company News Corp and was also a major Theranos investor. She argued that Carrie Rue's investigation was unfair, biased, and based on false information from disgruntled former employees. She suggested that publishing critical articles about Theranos would harm Murdoch's investment. This created a conflict of interest where the journal's owner had financial incentive to suppress negative coverage of a company he had invested in. To their credit, the journal's editors maintained editorial independence. They allowed Carrie Rue to continue investigating and ultimately published his findings despite the potential impact on Murdoch's investment. This decision reflected the institutional culture at major journalism organizations that editorial decisions shouldn't be influenced by ownership's financial interests. But it required editors to resist significant pressure from both Theranos and potentially from ownership. Carrie Rue's reporting methodology was meticulous. He interviewed dozens of former employees, reviewed internal documents that sources provided, and consulted with independent experts to verify technical claims. He gave Theranos extensive opportunity to respond to specific allegations, sending detailed questions about their technology, quality control practices, and regulatory compliance. This careful process was necessary both to ensure accuracy and to protect against defamation lawsuits that Theranos would likely file if the article contained errors. Theranos' written responses to Carrie Rue's questions were revealing in what they didn't say. The company provided general assertions that their technology worked and that they met all regulatory requirements, but they didn't provide specific data, validation studies, or concrete evidence that would actually address the concerns being raised. They attacked the credibility of former employees who had provided information, and they threatened legal action if the journal published false and defamatory allegations. The first article appeared on October 15, 2015, under the headline, "Hot Startup Theranos Has Struggled with Its Blood Test Technology." The article detailed allegations from whistleblowers that Theranos was using commercial analyzers for most tests while claiming to use proprietary technology. It reported that former employees had raised concerns about quality control and result accuracy, and it quoted experts questioning whether Theranos' claimed capabilities were technically feasible. Holmes' response was immediate and aggressive. She appeared on Jim Cramer's Mad Money television program on CNBC that same evening, insisting that the allegations were absolutely false. She claimed that Theranos ran most tests on proprietary devices, not commercial analyzers. She said the company had rigorous quality control and that their results were accurate and reliable. She portrayed the whistleblowers as disgruntled former employees who didn't understand the technology. Over the following days, Holmes conducted a media blitz defending Theranos. She appeared on multiple television programs, gave interviews to print publications, and had allies and board members issue supportive statements. George Shultz wrote an op-ed defending Holmes' integrity. Other board members vouched for having seen the technology work. Investors issued statements of continued support, but the initial article had opened floodgates. Other media organizations began investigating Theranos, now that the journal had broken the story. Regulators accelerated their reviews, and former employees who had been afraid to speak previously became more willing to provide information now that public scrutiny had focused on the company. Carrie Rue continued publishing follow-up articles over the subsequent months. Each article revealed new details about Theranos problems, regulatory violations, investor complaints, partnership failures, and technical deficiencies. The reporting was relentless and detailed, systematically dismantling the mythology that Holmes had constructed around Theranos. A critical article in April 2016 detailed the findings from the CMS inspection that found Theranos had posed immediate jeopardy to patient health. This article was particularly damaging because it reported findings from federal regulators rather than relying solely on whistleblower allegations. The government had independently confirmed that Theranos' laboratory practices were dangerously deficient. The regulatory findings made Holmes' continued denials increasingly untenable. She couldn't dismiss federal inspectors as disgruntled employees or ignorant critics. The violations were documented in official reports based on detailed inspections. The immediate jeopardy finding was the most serious category of deficiency, indicating that inspectors had found practices likely to cause serious patient harm. Additional reporting revealed that Theranos had misled partners and investors through fabricated demonstrations and false validation data. Sources described demonstrations for investors where commercial analyzers were hidden inside Theranos-branded boxes to create the impression that Theranos devices were producing the results. Former employees detailed how validation reports were modified to present better accuracy and precision than actual testing had achieved. These revelations transformed the narrative from questions about whether Theranos' technology worked to evidence of systematic fraud. Holmes wasn't just an ambitious entrepreneur whose technology had fallen short. She had deliberately deceived investors, partners, and patients about fundamental capabilities of her devices. The fabricated demonstrations and falsified validation data demonstrated conscious fraud rather than mere failure to achieve ambitious goals. The media attention created cascading consequences. Walgreens and Safeway terminated their partnerships. Investors began filing lawsuits seeking return of their funds. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation into whether Theranos had committed securities fraud. The Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation. State regulatory boards began investigating whether physicians who had relied on Theranos results in treating patients had been misled about the test's reliability. Holmes' public statements during this period were increasingly desperate and detached from reality. She continued insisting that Theranos technology worked, even as mounting evidence demonstrated otherwise. She blamed critics and competitors for trying to destroy her company. She compared herself to Steve Jobs and other visionaries who faced skepticism before ultimately succeeding. The comparison was delusional. Jobs had delivered products that actually worked, while Holmes had built a company on fabrications. The psychological dimension of Holmes's behavior during the exposure period is particularly fascinating. She seemed genuinely convinced that she was being unfairly persecuted rather than held accountable for fraud. This could reflect several possibilities. She might have believed her own mythology so completely that she couldn't acknowledge that her technology didn't work. She might have rationalized her deceptions as temporary expedients that would be vindicated once the technology was finally perfected. Or she might have been consciously lying while understanding that her only hope of avoiding consequences was maintaining the fiction to the end. Former employees and people who knew Holmes described her as someone who could compartmentalize contradictory beliefs. She apparently could simultaneously know that her devices didn't work reliably while presenting absolute confidence to investors that the technology was revolutionary. This cognitive dissonance might have been enabled by her extreme ambition and conviction that she was destined to change the world. The ends revolutionizing healthcare justified any means necessary, including deception. The media's role in both building and destroying Theranos raises questions about journalistic responsibility. The same publications that had run glowing profiles celebrating Holmes as a visionary entrepreneur later published devastating investigations exposing her fraud. Why had earlier coverage been so uncritical? Why hadn't journalists been more skeptical about extraordinary claims that lacked independent verification? Part of the answer is that business journalism often celebrates entrepreneurship and innovation without adequately scrutinizing whether the celebrated companies actually deliver what they promise. Reporters writing feature stories about successful entrepreneurs typically aren't investigative journalists looking for fraud. They're writing narratives that fit established templates about visionary founders disrupting industries. Holmes gave them exactly the story they wanted. Young woman succeeding in male-dominated field, Stanford dropout changing healthcare, next Steve Jobs. The more critical answer is that uncritical celebration of entrepreneurs serves media organizations' interests. Positive stories about innovative companies attract readers and advertising. They create relationships with powerful people and companies that can be sources for future stories. And they avoid the legal risks and resource costs of investigative reporting that might be challenged. Investigative journalism like Carrie Bruce requires significant time, resources and institutional support that most media organizations are reluctant to invest. Theranos' collapse demonstrated both the power and limitations of investigative journalism. When finally applied, media scrutiny exposed fraud that regulators and investors had failed to detect. But the scrutiny came years late, after Holmes had raised hundreds of millions of dollars and potentially harmed thousands of patients. Earlier critical coverage might have prevented much of the damage. Criminal investigation. The regulatory sanctions against Theranos and the media exposure of fraud triggered criminal investigations by federal prosecutors. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of California, which has jurisdiction over Silicon Valley, began examining whether Holmes and other Theranos executives had committed wire fraud, securities fraud, or other federal crimes through their deceptions of investors, partners, and patients. Criminal prosecution of corporate executives is relatively rare, particularly in Silicon Valley, where aggressive promotion and ambitious claims are normalized parts of startup culture. Prosecutors must prove criminal intent, that defendants knowingly made false statements with intent to defraud, rather than merely showing that representations were inaccurate or overly optimistic. The distinction between criminal fraud and aggressive entrepreneurship can be subtle, requiring prosecutors to demonstrate clear evidence of knowing deception. The investigation focused initially on gathering documentary evidence. Federal agents obtained emails, text messages, internal presentations, and other records from Theranos' systems. They interviewed dozens of former employees who could describe the company's practices and management's knowledge of technical problems. They reviewed validation studies, quality control data, and regulatory inspection reports to establish what Holmes and other executives knew about their device's limitations. The documentary evidence proved damning. Internal emails showed Holmes and Balwani receiving reports about quality control failures, device malfunctions, and unreliable results. They were told by laboratory staff and technical employees that the devices weren't ready for patient testing. They received warnings that continuing to operate under these conditions risked patient harm and regulatory violations. Yet they continued operating blood testing centers and making representations to investors and partners that the technology worked reliably. Particularly incriminating were communications about demonstrations for potential investors and partners. Records showed that employees were instructed to use commercial analyzers hidden inside Theranos-branded casings for demonstrations. Validation reports were modified to present better results than actual testing had achieved. And Holmes personally made specific false statements about device capabilities, test volumes, and commercial relationships that she knew were untrue. The investment materials Theranos provided to potential investors contained numerous false statements that could support securities fraud charges. Theranos claimed to be generating over $100 million in annual revenue when actual revenue was far lower. They claimed to be running most tests on proprietary devices when most were actually run on commercial analyzers. They provided financial projections that bore no relationship to realistic expectations. And they claimed to have validated their technology through rigorous testing when in reality, comprehensive validation had never been performed. In June 2018, federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against Holmes and Balwani. The indictment included 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Wire fraud charges relate to use of interstate communications, emails, phone calls, wire transfers to execute fraudulent schemes. Each count carried maximum penalties of 20 years in prison and substantial fines. The indictment detailed specific misrepresentations that formed the basis for the fraud charges. Holmes and Balwani allegedly lied to investors about Theranos' revenue, profitability, and commercial partnerships. They allegedly misrepresented the extent to which Theranos devices were used for patient testing. They allegedly falsified validation reports showing device accuracy and precision. And they allegedly concealed quality control problems and regulatory deficiencies that would have affected investment decisions. The conspiracy charges related to agreements between Holmes and Balwani to deceive investors and others. Proving conspiracy requires showing that defendants agreed to commit fraud and took actions in furtherance of the conspiracy. The evidence included communications between Holmes and Balwani, discussing how to respond to questions from investors, what information to provide and what to withhold, and how to manage demonstrations and validation studies. Holmes and Balwani were charged separately, reflecting their distinct roles in Theranos' operations. Holmes was CEO and the public face of the company, primarily responsible for investor relations, media engagement, and strategic partnerships. Balwani was COO and managed internal operations, including the laboratories where patient testing occurred. Both were charged because both participated in the schemes to defraud, though prosecutors would need to prove each defendant's specific knowledge and intent. The Securities and Exchange Commission filed parallel civil charges against Holmes and Balwani, alleging that they had committed securities fraud by making material misrepresentations to investors. Civil fraud charges require lower burden of proof than criminal charges, preponderance of evidence rather than beyond reasonable doubt, and can result in financial penalties and prohibitions on serving as corporate officers, but not imprisonment. Holmes settled the SEC charges without admitting or denying wrongdoing. The settlement required her to pay a $500,000 penalty, return her remaining equity stake in Theranos, and accept a prohibition on serving as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years. The settlement was relatively lenient given the magnitude of alleged fraud, possibly reflecting SEC's desire to secure a quick resolution rather than litigating complex securities fraud claims. Balwani chose not to settle with the SEC and fought the civil charges, maintaining that he hadn't committed fraud. His strategy in the civil case was to argue that he had reasonably relied on information provided by Holmes and technical staff, and that any misrepresentations weren't knowing or intentional. This defense faced significant challenges given the documentary evidence showing he received information about quality control problems and device limitations. The criminal charges against Holmes created a spectacle that riveted Silicon Valley and the broader business community. The question wasn't whether Theranos had committed fraud. The evidence was overwhelming that the company had systematically deceived investors, partners, and patients. The question was whether Holmes would be held personally criminally accountable for that fraud, or whether she would somehow avoid conviction despite her central role in perpetrating the scheme. Holmes' legal strategy evolved as her trial approached. Initially, she maintained that Theranos technology worked and that allegations of fraud were false. As evidence mounted, this position became untenable. She shifted to arguing that while some representations might have been inaccurate, they reflected honest mistakes or optimistic projections rather than knowing fraud. Entrepreneurs frequently make aggressive claims about products under development. This was standard startup behavior, not criminal conduct. This defense faced the problem that the evidence showed not merely aggressive promotion but systematic fabrication. Demonstrating devices using hidden commercial analyzers wasn't optimistic projection, it was deliberate deception. Modifying validation reports to show better results than testing had achieved wasn't entrepreneurial enthusiasm, it was falsification. And continuing to operate blood testing centers while knowing that quality control was inadequate wasn't ambitious risk-taking, it was reckless endangerment. As trial approached, Holmes introduced a new defense that would become central to her strategy. She claimed to have been psychologically and emotionally abused by Sunny Balwani, who had controlled and manipulated her throughout their relationship. This abuse allegedly affected her judgment and decision-making, potentially providing a defense to criminal charges by suggesting she wasn't acting with the independent intent required for fraud conviction. The abuse allegations were explosive and controversial. Holmes claimed that Balwani had subjected her to emotional and sexual abuse, controlled her diet and schedule, and manipulated her into making decisions she wouldn't have made independently. If true, these allegations could potentially affect jury assessment of her culpability. Jurors might view her more sympathetically as a victim rather than a calculating fraudster. Balwani vehemently denied the abuse allegations, and there was limited independent evidence supporting Holmes's claims. They had been in a romantic relationship for years, which she had concealed from investors and board members. But whether that relationship involved abuse as Holmes alleged, or was a partnership of equals who jointly perpetrated fraud, would be for the jury to assess based on available evidence. The abuse defense strategy was legally complex. Duress can sometimes provide a defense to criminal charges if a defendant was coerced into illegal conduct by threats of immediate harm. But Holmes wasn't claiming duress in the traditional sense. Balwani hadn't threatened her with violence if she didn't commit fraud. She was claiming a more subtle form of psychological manipulation that affected her judgment over years. Whether this met legal standards for any recognized defense was uncertain. The strategic decision to raise abuse allegations also carried risks. It contradicted Holmes's previous persona as a strong, independent founder who was in complete control of her company. It invited scrutiny of her relationship with Balwani and her decision to conceal that relationship from investors, and it risked alienating jurors who might view it as a cynical attempt to avoid accountability by claiming victimhood. The criminal investigation also examined whether to charge other Theranos executives or board members. Several executives who had held senior positions during the fraud period left the company and avoided charges, though it wasn't clear whether they had cooperated with prosecutors or whether prosecutors simply concluded there wasn't sufficient evidence of criminal intent. Board members weren't charged, likely because their role was oversight rather than operational control, and because proving they knowingly participated in fraud would be difficult. The selective prosecution raised fairness questions. Why were Holmes and Balwani being criminally charged when other executives and board members who had enabled or failed to detect the fraud faced no criminal consequences? Part of the answer was evidentiary. Prosecutors could prove that Holmes and Balwani had knowing intent to defraud based on documentary evidence of their communications and decisions. Proving the same for other individuals would be more difficult. Another part of the answer was pragmatic. Prosecuting every person who might have had some culpability would require enormous resources and might not be successful. Prosecutors focused on the individuals who had the greatest responsibility and the clearest evidence of criminal intent. This was standard practice in corporate fraud prosecutions, where leadership typically faced criminal charges, while lower-level employees who implemented illegal practices generally avoided prosecution if they cooperated with investigations. Trial reckoning. Elizabeth Holmes's criminal trial began in September 2021, more than 3 years after she was indicted. The delay reflected both the complexity of the case and disruptions from COVID-19 pandemic that suspended many court proceedings. The trial became a media spectacle, attracting daily coverage and public fascination with the question of whether one of Silicon Valley's most celebrated entrepreneurs would be convicted of fraud and sentenced to prison. The prosecution's case was methodical and documentary-heavy. They presented hundreds of emails, text messages, and internal presentations showing what Holmes knew about Theranos' technical problems and when she knew it. They showed communications where employees reported quality control failures, device malfunctions, and unreliable results. They presented evidence that Holmes had been told the devices weren't ready for patient testing, yet continued operating blood testing centers anyway. Particularly damaging were communications about demonstrations for investors. Prosecutors showed that employees had been instructed to set up demonstrations using commercial analyzers hidden inside Theranos-branded boxes. Holmes had personally participated in these demonstrations, performing finger pricks and showing investors how supposedly Theranos devices produced results in real time. But the devices producing the results were actually commercial analyzers made by Siemens, not Theranos technology. The investment materials Theranos had provided to potential investors contained numerous specific false statements. Theranos claimed partnerships with major pharmaceutical companies that were either exaggerated or entirely fabricated. They claimed to be generating over $100 million in revenue when actual revenue was a fraction of that amount. They claimed their devices had been validated through extensive testing, when in reality such validation had never been completed, and they provided financial projections that bore no relationship to realistic expectations based on the actual state of their business and technology. Prosecutors called several investors who testified about the representations that had induced them to invest. Some had lost tens of millions of dollars based on their belief that Holmes' claims about the technology were accurate. They testified that had they known the truth about device reliability, revenue, and partnerships, they would not have invested. This testimony was necessary to establish that the false statements were material to investment decisions, an element of securities fraud charges. Former employees provided crucial testimony about internal operations at Theranos. Laboratory personnel described quality control failures, pressure to report results despite reliability concerns, and instances where patient samples had to be rerun multiple times because devices produced inconsistent results. Scientists testified about being told to modify validation reports to present better results than testing had actually achieved. Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung testified about their experiences as whistleblowers, describing what they had witnessed at Theranos and the retaliation they faced for raising concerns. Their testimony was powerful because they were young employees with no obvious motive to fabricate allegations against Holmes. They had tried to address problems through internal channels before going to regulators, and they had faced serious personal and professional consequences for speaking out. The prosecution also presented expert testimony from clinical laboratory scientists who explained why Theranos' claimed capabilities weren't technically feasible. These experts described the fundamental problems with using capillary blood from finger pricks, working with extremely small sample volumes, and achieving reliable results across hundreds of different tests. They testified that the scientific consensus in the diagnostic testing field was that what Theranos claimed to have achieved wasn't possible with current technology. Holmes' defense strategy centered on several arguments. First, they argued that she had genuinely believed Theranos' technology would eventually work, and that any misstatements reflected optimism rather than fraud. Entrepreneurs frequently make aggressive projections about products under development. This was standard startup behavior that shouldn't be criminalized. Second, they emphasized that she had surrounded herself with experienced advisors and board members who had validated her approach, suggesting she had reasonable basis for her beliefs. Third, they introduced her allegations of abuse by Balwani, suggesting that her judgment and decision-making had been compromised by the relationship. The defense called several witnesses who testified that Holmes had been passionate about Theranos' mission and genuinely believed in the technology. Character witnesses described her work ethic and commitment to changing healthcare. They portrayed her as someone who had worked tirelessly toward a legitimate goal rather than someone who had cynically perpetrated fraud. Holmes herself testified, taking a significant risk by subjecting herself to cross-examination. Her testimony lasted several days and covered her background, her relationship with Balwani, and her decision-making at Theranos. She claimed that she had believed the technology would eventually work, and that the company just needed more time to perfect it. She acknowledged that some demonstrations might have been misleading, but argued that this reflected startup culture of showing what products would do, rather than their current state. Her testimony about Balwani's alleged abuse was dramatic and emotional. She claimed he had controlled many aspects of her life, from what she ate, to how she dressed, to how she ran the company. She suggested that he had manipulated her into making decisions she wouldn't have made independently. This testimony was designed to make jurors view her as a victim rather than a calculating fraudster. The prosecution's cross-examination of Holmes was devastating. Prosecutors confronted her with specific false statements she had made to investors, asking her to explain why she had made claims she knew were untrue. They showed emails where she had received information about quality control problems, yet continued representing to investors that the devices were reliable. They demonstrated that she had personally participated in demonstrations using commercial analyzers, while telling investors the results came from Theranos devices. Holmes struggled to provide convincing explanations for many of these contradictions. She frequently claimed she couldn't recall specific details, or that she had relied on information provided by subordinates. But prosecutors showed that she had been directly involved in decisions about what information to provide investors and how to structure demonstrations. She couldn't credibly claim ignorance of false statements she had personally made. The jury deliberated for 7 days before reaching a verdict in January 2022. They found Holmes guilty on 4 counts, 1 count of conspiracy to defraud investors and 3 counts of wire fraud against specific investors. They acquitted her on 4 counts relating to defrauding patients, apparently concluding that prosecutors hadn't sufficiently proven her intent to defraud patients, as opposed to merely being reckless about patient safety. 3 counts were designated as deadlocked mistrials. The mixed verdict was somewhat surprising. Legal observers had expected either complete conviction or complete acquittal, not a nuanced verdict that found fraud against investors but not against patients. The distinction suggested that jurors had carefully evaluated evidence for each count, rather than making a general judgment about Holmes' culpability. Sentencing was scheduled for several months later to allow both sides to prepare arguments about appropriate punishment. Federal sentencing guidelines suggested a range of approximately 10–20 years in prison, based on the conviction counts and the amount of money defrauded. But judges have significant discretion in sentencing, and the defense would argue for leniency based on Holmes being a first-time offender, her pregnancy, she had become pregnant during trial, and their claims about her having been abused. The prosecution would argue for substantial prison time as both punishment and deterrence. They would emphasize that Holmes had defrauded sophisticated investors of hundreds of millions of dollars through systematic lies maintained over years. They would note that she had shown no remorse and had continued denying wrongdoing even after conviction. And they would argue that lenient sentencing would send the message that wealthy Silicon Valley executives could commit massive fraud without facing serious consequences. In November 2022, Judge Edward Davila sentenced Holmes to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. The sentence was less than the 15 years prosecutors had requested, but more than the 18 months defense attorneys had argued for. Judge Davila noted that while he considered Holmes' personal circumstances, the magnitude of the fraud and the need for deterrence required substantial prison time. Holmes was ordered to report to prison in April 2023, but she filed appeals seeking to remain free while challenging her conviction. The appeals focused on legal arguments about whether certain evidence should have been admitted and whether jury instructions were proper. Most legal experts considered the appeals unlikely to succeed given the strength of evidence against her, but the process could delay her imprisonment for months or years. The sentencing brought formal closure to Holmes's criminal case while leaving broader questions unresolved. She had been convicted and would serve significant prison time, representing a rare case of a Silicon Valley executive being held criminally accountable for corporate fraud. But the trial and conviction hadn't fully addressed how she had been able to perpetrate fraud for so long, deceiving sophisticated investors and operating undetected by regulators until whistleblowers forced public scrutiny. Sunny Balwani's trial occurred separately in 2022, resulting in conviction on all 12 counts he faced, 2 counts of conspiracy and 10 counts of wire fraud. His convictions covered both defrauding investors and defrauding patients, suggesting that jurors in his trial found the evidence of intent to defraud patients clearer than Holmes' jury had. He was sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison, slightly more than Holmes despite his lower public profile, possibly reflecting that he didn't benefit from the sympathy some jurors apparently felt for Holmes. The divergent jury verdicts in the 2 trials raised questions about whether Holmes' gender and her abuse allegations had affected jury assessment of her culpability. Balwani was convicted on all counts, while Holmes was acquitted on the patient fraud charges and had mistrials on several other counts. Did jurors view her more sympathetically because she was a young woman who claimed to have been abused? Would a male defendant presenting the same defense have received similar treatment? These questions couldn't be definitively answered but sparked discussions about how gender affects criminal justice outcomes. Psychological patterns. Understanding how Elizabeth Holmes perpetrated fraud for over a decade requires examining the psychological patterns that enabled her deception both of others and potentially of herself. The case raises questions about the line between delusional belief and conscious fraud, about how intelligent people convince themselves to maintain lies, and about the personality characteristics that enable someone to deceive investors, employees, and patients without apparent remorse. Holmes displayed several characteristics common among successful fraudsters. First was extraordinary self-confidence bordering on grandiosity. She genuinely seemed to believe she was destined to change the world, that conventional limitations didn't apply to her, and that skeptics simply didn't understand her vision. This grandiosity wasn't necessarily conscious fraud. She may have actually believed she was a genius who would eventually solve the technical problems that prevented her technology from working. Second was an ability to compartmentalize contradictory information. Holmes could simultaneously know that her devices didn't work reliably while presenting absolute confidence to investors that the technology was revolutionary. This compartmentalization allowed her to maintain different versions of reality for different audiences, admitting problems to technical staff while denying them to investors. Psychologically, this required either remarkable dishonesty or an unusual ability to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously. Third was a lack of apparent empathy for people harmed by her deceptions. Investors who lost millions, employees whose careers were damaged, patients who received unreliable test results, Holmes showed little visible concern for their suffering. When confronted with evidence of harm, she responded with justifications about her good intentions and the importance of her mission. The ends justified the means in her moral framework. Fourth was an ability to rationalize unethical behavior as temporary expedients necessary to achieve legitimate goals. Demonstrating devices using hidden commercial analyzers could be justified as showing investors what the technology would eventually do. Modifying validation reports could be rationalized as presenting the best interpretation of data. Running patient tests on commercial analyzers could be framed as temporary backup while Theranos devices were being perfected. Each step seemed potentially justifiable in isolation, even though collectively they constituted massive fraud. These patterns are familiar from studies of other major fraudsters. Bernie Madoff, who ran a Ponzi scheme that defrauded investors of billions, displayed similar characteristics: grandiosity, compartmentalization, apparent lack of empathy, and rationalization of illegal behavior as temporary measures that would eventually be resolved. The psychological profile of someone capable of sustaining major fraud over years includes these elements of personality that enable continued deception despite mounting evidence of harm. But Holmes also displayed characteristics that distinguished her from typical fraudsters. She was female in a male-dominated field, which created different dynamics around how people perceived and responded to her. She was young, which made her ambition seem inspiring rather than threatening to older investors and advisors. And she cultivated a specific persona: the Steve Jobs black turtlenecks, the deep voice, the intense eye contact that was carefully constructed to project authority and vision. The question of whether Holmes actually believed her own lies is psychologically fascinating and legally relevant. If she genuinely convinced herself that Theranos' technology would eventually work and that her deceptions were temporary expedients, her subjective culpability might be different than if she knew she was perpetrating a fraud with no realistic chance of success. The criminal law requires proving intent to defraud, knowing deception. If Holmes had deluded herself into believing her own mythology, the intent element might be harder to prove. The evidence suggests that Holmes was aware she was lying, at least about specific representations to investors. Emails showed her receiving information about quality control problems, yet continuing to tell investors the devices were reliable. She personally participated in demonstrations using commercial analyzers while representing that results came from Theranos devices. These weren't optimistic projections, they were knowing falsehoods about current reality. But on the deeper question of whether she believed the technology would eventually work, Holmes may have genuinely maintained hope or belief despite contrary evidence. Entrepreneurs frequently display what psychologists call optimism bias, systematic tendency to believe positive outcomes are more likely than objective evidence suggests. In startup culture, this optimism is celebrated as essential to achieving difficult goals. The line between productive optimism and delusional belief can be unclear. Holmes' relationship with Sunny Balwani adds additional psychological complexity. Her allegations that he abused and controlled her, if true, could have affected her judgment and decision-making in ways that reduced her culpability. Abusive relationships can create psychological patterns where victims comply with abuser demands, rationalize problematic behavior, and struggle to extricate themselves even when they recognize the situation is harmful. But skepticism about these abuse allegations is warranted given that Holmes raised them only when facing criminal charges, years after the relationship had ended. She had opportunities to report abuse or seek help during the relationship but apparently didn't, and the allegations conveniently provided potential legal defense to fraud charges by suggesting her judgment was compromised. Whether the allegations were genuine or strategic is difficult to determine without independent evidence. The psychological impact on Theranos employees, particularly those who tried to address problems through internal channels, deserves attention. Employees who raised concerns about quality control or patient safety were told they weren't committed to the mission, didn't understand the technology, or were harming the company. This gaslighting, denying or distorting reality to make someone question their own perception, created an environment where people doubted their own judgment, even when they were correct about serious problems. Tyler Schultz and others described the psychological toll of knowing that patient safety was being compromised while being told they were wrong to raise concerns. They faced a choice between accepting management's denials and trusting their own observations. Those who trusted their observations and persisted in raising concerns were fired or marginalized. Those who accepted management's denials often later felt guilty about having enabled harm to patients by not speaking out more forcefully. The investors who were defrauded experienced their own psychological impacts. Many had trusted Holmes based on her compelling presentation and the social proof of other prestigious investors' participation. Discovering they had been systematically deceived was both financially devastating and personally humiliating. Some investors had encouraged friends or family members to invest, creating guilt about having recommended a fraudulent opportunity. The psychological aftermath for George Schultz was particularly tragic. At 95 years old, he had to acknowledge that his judgment about Holmes had been catastrophically wrong. He had believed in her so completely that he had pressured his own grandson to recant truthful allegations about Theranos' fraud. Coming to terms with having enabled fraud and having damaged his relationship with Tyler required extraordinary humility and willingness to admit error. Schultz eventually did acknowledge he had been deceived and reconciled with Tyler, but the process was painful. The broader psychological question is why so many sophisticated, intelligent people believed Holmes despite warning signs that should have triggered skepticism. The answer involves several cognitive biases that affect human judgment. Confirmation bias led people to interpret ambiguous information as supporting their preferred belief that Theranos was legitimate. Authority bias made investors reluctant to question someone who was endorsed by figures like George Schultz and Henry Kissinger. And optimism bias made people want to believe that revolutionary healthcare technology was possible. Social dynamics amplified these individual biases. Once early investors and board members had committed to supporting Theranos, they had reputational and financial stakes in the company succeeding. Acknowledging that Holmes was a fraud would require admitting their own judgment had failed. The psychological pressure to maintain belief in Theranos increased with each additional commitment of capital, time, or reputation. This created a self-reinforcing dynamic where the more invested people became, the harder it was to acknowledge the truth. Holmes understood these dynamics, whether consciously or intuitively, and exploited them effectively. She created situations where people made initial commitments based on limited information, then used those commitments to extract additional investments or endorsements. She surrounded herself with prestigious advisors whose involvement made skepticism seem unreasonable. and she cultivated personal relationships with key investors and board members that made them psychologically invested in her success beyond their financial stakes. The case illustrates how fraud often succeeds not despite the intelligence of victims, but partly because of it. Sophisticated investors and accomplished professionals made assessments based on reasonable-seeming heuristics, trust people endorsed by trusted colleagues, assume that prestigious board members have conducted adequate due diligence, believe that revolutionary technologies emerge from visionary entrepreneurs. These heuristics work well in many contexts, but can be exploited by skilled fraudsters who understand how to manipulate them. Investor consequences. The investors who lost over $700 million in Theranos faced a difficult question after the fraud was exposed. Could they recover any of their investments through litigation? The answer involved complex legal questions about what claims they could bring, what damages they could prove, and what assets might be available to satisfy any judgments. Civil litigation against Holmes and Balwani faced immediate obstacles. Both had limited personal assets beyond their Theranos equity, which had become essentially worthless. Holmes had been fabulously wealthy on paper when Theranos was valued at $9 billion, but that wealth evaporated when the company collapsed. Recovering $700 million from defendants who lacked sufficient assets to pay such judgments was practically impossible regardless of legal merits. Some investors pursued claims against other parties who might have deeper pockets. Law firms that had advised Theranos on securities transactions faced claims that they should have identified and disclosed problems with the company's representations. Accounting firms that had reviewed Theranos' financial statements faced similar claims. And some investors explored whether board members might have personal liability for failing to adequately oversee the company. These derivative claims faced substantial legal obstacles. Attorneys and accountants can't be liable simply because their client committed fraud. The investors would need to prove that the professionals themselves were negligent or participated in the fraud. Board members generally have protection from personal liability through business judgment rule and indemnification arrangements, except in cases of gross negligence or intentional misconduct. The litigation strategy became focused on extracting whatever value remained from Theranos' corporate assets and pursuing insurance proceeds that might cover some claims. Theranos had various insurance policies, including directors' and officers' liability insurance that might cover board members' potential liability and professional liability insurance that might cover claims against law firms and accountants. But insurance coverage for fraud is limited. Policies typically exclude coverage for intentional wrongful acts. Partner organizations that had suffered losses from Theranos relationships also pursued claims. Walgreens sued Theranos, seeking return of the approximately $140 million they had invested in the partnership. Safeway sought damages for the $350 million they had spent preparing stores for a Theranos partnership that never fully materialized. These claims were somewhat more successful than investor claims because they could point to specific contractual commitments that Theranos had breached. The Walgreens litigation settled for an undisclosed amount that was reportedly far less than their total losses. The settlement reflected the reality that Theranos' bankruptcy estate had limited assets to distribute among creditors. Early settlements avoided the risk of receiving nothing if the company's remaining assets were exhausted paying other claims. But it meant Walgreens absorbed substantial losses from their partnership with a fraudulent company. Safeway faced a particularly difficult situation because much of their $350 million spending had gone into renovating stores and building infrastructure for Theranos testing centers. These weren't funds transferred to Theranos that might potentially be recovered. They were sunk costs that Safeway had incurred based on Theranos' promises about future partnership. Recovering such consequential damages through litigation is difficult, even when the defendant has assets to pay judgments. The investor losses raised questions about whether existing securities laws adequately protected investors from startup fraud. Theranos had remained a private company throughout its history, avoiding the public disclosure requirements that apply to publicly traded corporations. Private companies have much more discretion about what information to disclose to investors and face fewer regulatory constraints on their representations. Some investors argued that securities law should be reformed to require greater disclosure from private companies raising substantial amounts of capital. When a company like Theranos raises hundreds of millions from investors, the distinction between private and public company becomes less meaningful from investor protection perspective. Perhaps companies above certain size thresholds should face enhanced disclosure requirements regardless of whether they're publicly traded. Others argued that sophisticated investors who could afford to invest millions in high-risk startups should bear responsibility for conducting adequate due diligence. If they chose to invest based on limited information and a compelling pitch, that was their decision, and they should accept the consequences. Imposing additional disclosure requirements on private companies might stifle innovation by making it harder for legitimate startups to raise capital. The debate reflected tension between investor protection and preserving entrepreneurial flexibility. Too much disclosure and regulatory oversight could make startup financing impractical and expensive. Too little created opportunities for fraud like Theranos. Finding the right balance was difficult, and different observers reached different conclusions about where that balance should be. The specific losses to individual investors varied widely. Rupert Murdoch lost $125 million but was wealthy enough to absorb that loss without material impact on his lifestyle. Other investors lost amounts that were financially catastrophic for them personally. Some had invested retirement savings or funds they needed for future security. The fraud's impact was thus highly uneven, hurting some victims far more than others, despite the shared experience of being deceived. Beyond direct financial losses, investors faced reputational damage from association with Theranos. Sophisticated investors who were defrauded by Holmes faced embarrassment and questions about their judgment. Some lost credibility in their professional roles, as colleagues and competitors questioned how they could have been fooled so completely. The reputational costs were harder to quantify than direct financial losses, but were real and substantial. The Walton family's investment losses were notable given their reputation for business acumen developed through Walmart's success. How had the family that built the world's largest retailer been deceived by Theranos? The answer illustrated that expertise in retail operations doesn't necessarily translate to judgment about medical technology. The Waltons had invested based on Theranos' potential as a retail pharmacy partner, not based on deep understanding of clinical diagnostics. Their mistake was trusting Holmes' representations about technology outside their domain of expertise. Betsy DeVos's losses became politically significant when she was appointed Secretary of Education in 2017, during Theranos' collapse. Critics pointed to her $100 million investment in a fraudulent healthcare company as evidence of poor judgment that should disqualify her from cabinet positions. Supporters argued that the investment had nothing to do with her qualifications for education policy, and that even sophisticated investors can be deceived by skillful fraud. The political dimensions of investor losses extended to the board members whose reputations were tarnished by association with Theranos. George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, James Mattis, and other distinguished figures had lent their credibility to Holmes' fraud, whether intentionally or through negligence in oversight. Their participation had helped Holmes attract investors and partners who assumed such prestigious figures would have validated the company's claims. In retrospect, the board's composition was itself a warning sign. Why would a medical device startup recruit board members with expertise in foreign policy and military affairs, rather than healthcare and diagnostics? The answer was that Holmes valued prestige and political connections over relevant technical expertise. She wanted board members who would enhance her credibility and provide access to networks, not board members who would rigorously evaluate whether her technology actually worked. This reflected a broader pattern in Silicon Valley, where board composition emphasized prestige and connections over domain expertise and effective oversight. Startup boards often consisted of investors and high-profile individuals who provided credibility and access rather than deep understanding of the company's technology or market. This model worked reasonably well when companies were pursuing legitimate opportunities, but it created vulnerability to fraud when board members lacked expertise to evaluate technical claims. The investor community's response to Theranos influenced how future investment opportunities would be evaluated. Some investors became more skeptical of charismatic founders making revolutionary claims, demanding more rigorous technical validation before committing capital. Others concluded that Theranos was an exceptional case that didn't require fundamental changes to their investment process. The degree to which lessons from Theranos actually changed investor behavior remained uncertain years after the fraud was exposed. Venture capital firms that avoided investing in Theranos despite being pitched by Holmes faced an interesting position. Some had declined because they couldn't validate the technology or were skeptical of the extreme secrecy. In retrospect, their skepticism was vindicated, but at the time, they risked missing what could have been a revolutionary opportunity if Holmes' claims had been accurate. The tension between maintaining skepticism that protects against fraud and maintaining openness to revolutionary innovation remained unresolved. When examining the complete arc of Elizabeth Holmes' fraud, from her founding of Theranos in 2003 through her conviction and sentencing in 2022, several truths emerge that transcend the specific mechanics of faked blood tests and defrauded investors. The scandal exposed systematic vulnerabilities in how American society evaluates entrepreneurial claims, regulates medical technologies, and holds corporate executives accountable for fraud. Holmes succeeded for over a decade, not despite the sophistication of investors, regulators, and partners, but partly because of it. Sophisticated actors relied on heuristics and social proof rather than rigorous independent validation. They assumed that other sophisticated actors had done adequate due diligence. They were reluctant to appear skeptical of potentially revolutionary innovation, and they had financial and reputational incentives to maintain belief in Theranos once they had committed resources to supporting it. The regulatory framework revealed fundamental weaknesses. Medical devices and clinical laboratories are regulated through separate agencies with limited coordination and resources. Companies can exploit gaps between jurisdictions, claim exemptions for novel technologies, and operate for years with minimal oversight if they avoid triggering specific enforcement actions. Routine inspections focus on compliance with procedural requirements rather than independent validation that technologies actually work as claimed. The human cost extended far beyond the measurable financial losses to investors. Thousands of patients received blood test results that may have been inaccurate, potentially leading to misdiagnoses, unnecessary treatments, or incorrect medication adjustments. Employees who tried to address problems internally faced retaliation and career damage. Whistleblowers who exposed the fraud incurred enormous personal and legal costs. Family relationships were damaged, as in the tragic case of Tyler Schultz and his grandfather. Whether Holmes will be remembered primarily as a cautionary tale about entrepreneurial fraud, or as a complex figure whose genuine ambition was corrupted by impossible goals and toxic culture will depend partly on how subsequent events unfold. Her appeals may succeed or fail. Additional information about her motivations and decision-making may emerge. Other startup frauds may provide new context for understanding Theranos. The broader question is whether American business culture will learn sustainable lessons from Theranos, or whether the patterns that enabled the fraud will persist with minor modifications. The optimistic view is that investors, regulators, and media have been educated by Theranos and will be more skeptical of similar schemes in the future. The pessimistic view is that human psychology and institutional incentives that enabled Holmes haven't fundamentally changed, and that future charismatic founders with compelling narratives will successfully exploit similar vulnerabilities. The case demonstrates that verification must be independent of trust, even when the people being verified are prestigious, connected, and seemingly credible. Theranos operated for years because people who should have demanded rigorous validation instead trusted Holmes based on her presentation, her advisors, and the social proof of other investors' participation. This trust was misplaced because it wasn't backed by actual verification of whether the underlying technology worked. Modern diagnostic technology has advanced significantly, and legitimate companies have achieved impressive miniaturization and improved accessibility of blood testing. These genuine innovations demonstrate that the goals Holmes articulated, making testing cheaper, faster, and more convenient, were worthwhile even though her specific approach was fraudulent. The existence of real innovation makes distinguishing between legitimate advances and fraudulent claims more difficult, requiring continued vigilance and rigorous validation. The ultimate legacy of Theranos may be a heightened awareness that revolutionary claims require revolutionary evidence, that prestigious endorsements don't substitute for technical validation, and that protecting patients and investors requires institutional skepticism, even toward entrepreneurs who seem destined for greatness. Whether this awareness persists and prevents future frauds, or whether it fades as new generations forget the specific lessons of Holmes' deception, will determine whether the enormous costs of the Theranos scandal produce lasting benefits through improved systems and culture.